Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Human Experience Elevated, a Hyosung podcast. I'm your host Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B, and it's good to be back in the hot seat with some thought leadership from the Hyosung team. Last episode was back in October of 23, and we're circling back around with some timely crash course analysis and strategy for y'all on an important topic that continues to shape the larger banking industry. But before we get into the specifics, I want to make sure you're all tapped into future and previous episodes of our podcast and other conversations with the Hyosung team. So make sure that you're heading to our website, hyosunginnovue.com. Again, that's hyosunginnovue.com for previous episodes of the podcast, as well as more information on how you can stay tuned with other future conversations that we're going to be recording here this year. All right, everyone, so today we're going to be breaking down a crash course on how to defend against the current state of card skimming, right? Today we're going to be breaking down this, current state of a persistent and rather evolving threat for the banking industry, which is card skimming, right? This isn't a particularly new issue, but it takes on new forms as technology changes and as bad actors try to keep up with a pretty common strategy for them, which is skimming information and money off of your cards. So with fraud of all types on the rise, ATM fraud has become a significant concern for financial institutions and customers alike. And so card skimming, if you're unaware, is where fraudsters steal card information through rogue devices attached to ATMs and other points of sale, right? This is something that they often warn you of when you go, traveling. Make sure you wiggle the ATM to make sure there isn't some fake card scanner on top of the machine that's going to then steal your data. But this isn't just a nuisance, right? And it isn't just a problem for consumers. It actually costs banks and the larger industry millions and millions, if not up to around $1 billion a year from these card skimming devices and theft occurrences. So as banks and credit unions and processors and ATM providers all step up their efforts to combat this threat, we're seeing a variety of evolving strategies come into focus for banking professionals. And this is both a blessing and a curse, right? So many options, but while that means a great tool set of strategies, where do you start, right? What makes the most sense to adapt to today's card skimming strategies and also future-proof against some of the ones on the horizon? So we're going to be breaking down these defensive measures in depth, how to protect against card skimming in today's environment of card skimming, how new card technologies and advanced ATM security features are making it harder for fraudsters to succeed and which ones you should deploy, and how financial institutions are adopting some innovative approaches to reduce the value of skimmed data and how that is going to shape the future of card security. So with all that, let's go ahead and jump into today's conversation. I'm pleased to welcome a recurring guest here on the show, one of my faves, Mr. Bill Buddy. He's Vice President of Banking Strategy and Solutions for Hyosung. Bill, welcome back in the hot seat. I guess the white seat today. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing great, man. Yeah, thank you for coming back in studio and sharing this much needed pulse check on a very familiar threat for the industry. But like I explained and like you're going to explain for us, it's one that changes often. So let's get into the meat of it, right? I gave our audience a high level on what card skimming is, but could you further explain what card skimming actually looks like in practice and how it affects both financial institutions as well as customers?
Well, yeah, so like the kind of the 101 level version, right, is that, the fraudster will take a device that is designed to read the data on the magnetic stripe on the back of your card and place it over a valid device, a thing like an ATM card reader or a point of sale device where you swipe your card to make a purchase. And that reader will, while the valid device is reading your card, that reader will also read the information off of your card and store it on a memory card inside the device, so that then when the fraudster comes back and retrieves the device, he has a whole list of credit card numbers or debit card numbers that they can use for fraudulent purposes. typically, it's paired with a camera as well, because when you're, especially from an ATM perspective, if you're stealing debit card numbers, you need to be able to also capture the PIN associated with the card.
Right.
So it'll be paired with a camera that will capture a customer's movements while they're entering the PIN after they've put their card into the ATM. So the two of those things combined will then be able to be used to make purchases elsewhere in a fraudulent manner.
Right.
As you mentioned, it's been around for a while. It continues to evolve, but the evolution really, in large part, is the size and materials of those fraudulent readers. When it started, it was relatively easy to see because they were large and bulky and looked bad. It was pretty easy to kind of see if you were paying attention. If you weren't paying attention, though, it was pretty easy to overlook. But as technology evolves, and as the Moore's law or whatever, the stuff with the multiplying of capabilities on a chip or whatever, it's kind of similar to that. As technology evolves, you require less and less space to have the technology to be able to read information off of a mag stripe, and your devices get smaller and smaller and less noticeable, and they take up less space, so they're harder to detect in an automated fashion as well as to detect from just an eyeball fashion.
Right. So, like I mentioned earlier, this is not just a nuisance. It's not just something that banking institutions try to operate around and whatever. It's just sort of a cost of doing business. It really is a financial burden on this industry because of how much it can cost providers and banking institutions. Again, skimming attacks are estimated to cost financial institutions and customers up to $1 billion a year. That's not insignificant. So
it's a lot of transactions, a lot of fraudulent transactions.
Totally.
That, those transactions happen, and sometimes they can be caught before there's a lot of damage, and sometimes not. And the longer that fraudulent card number is used before it's stopped, the more exposure a bank or a credit union or a processor or a place of business or ultimately a consumer might have, depending on where some of those losses end up, right? Because there's different scenarios that put the onus on different parties in that situation. A lot of times, the bank or credit union that owns the card will reimburse consumers if there's fraudulent activity, but there are certain circumstances where they don't, and there are also circumstances where a merchant might be out because someone made a fraudulent purchase. They got the goods, but then they don't end up getting the money because a chargeback happens or what have you. So there's a lot of different people. There's a lot of different points in the chain that are impacted by that very large sum of money that is fraudulently being stolen over every year.
Right. And what stands out to me is how much it's a relationship damager for all of those chains, right? When this kind of threat goes unchecked, it's impacting the relationship that customers have with their bank, right? They no longer trust their banking institution. Oh, well, you can't even catch card skimming on your ATM. How can I trust you to hold my money, right? Let's say merchant and point of sale system provider, right? Why is your technology not more secure? And so all of this kind of then ensuring, okay, if this does happen, who's now going to pay out, right? And that puts tension on these relationships too. So this is more than just a nuisance. It's more than just a financial burden. It's also getting right to the heart of, relationships that can be kind of tenuous because we're talking about people's money, right? And we're talking about the consistency of ensuring a quality transaction for a merchant, for a customer. So it's definitely a tricky.
And even in situations where the bank will make a customer whole if their card number has been stolen or whatever, it's still an impact to the person, right? Because now they've got to call in and they've got to make sure that those charges come off, and they've got to get a new card, so they got to wait for that to come. And so there's impacts beyond just even the financial too, that impact kind of just your day-to-day life as a consumer.
Right. So let's look at how this is evolving now in real time, right? With fraud types always evolving, there's new strategies, and as we find that more of these more analog pieces of hardware are now being connected to a network of smart devices that are all gathering data to help make larger business decisions for all parties involved. There are new backdoors, right? And so I'm curious what some of the latest trends are in skimming. You know what I mean? Like what kind of technology is being put to work out there to capture that data, and how does it look different from 10 years ago even?
Well, I mean, skimming is still a pretty old school type of technology.
Sure.
The advancements there really come from being able to pack the same capability that has always been necessary to copy those card numbers into a significantly smaller space.
Which I'm guessing is just harder to see and
It's
detect.
harder to see and harder to detect and harder to prevent. One thing that was always relatively effective in preventing skimmers from being from being able to be effective and take and read those cards in extras because it's an extra device that's laid over a card reader. If you created a scenario in that card reader where the space inside was limited to exactly the size of a card, well, then you couldn't fit something in to also read it secondarily because there was no space. If there was something in there, then the card wouldn't fit. So, even if a customer didn't catch it on site, sticking the card in wasn't going to work because it wouldn't fit.
Right.
But as technology gets smaller and those things get thinner and thinner and thinner, and you still have to allow for a little bit of a tolerance, you can get to a point where a skimmer is so thin that you can't squeeze it anymore. Right? If you squeeze that space too much, then cards won't be able to fit even without a skimmer in there. Right? So that's one of a big advancement is the size. And what comes with that is also it's harder to visually detect as well.
Right. You
don't
wriggle
anything.
off the whole big chunk of plastic.
That's right, because it's not a big chunk of plastic anymore. It's tiny. It's like basically an overlay, almost like the screen protector that you put on your iPhone. Right. It's so thin and so just kind of blends in with everything that it doesn't stand out as much as those big, huge chunks of plastic that looked pretty egregious before.
Right.
And then the materials as well make it harder to detect because there used to be a lot of metal in those things. So another detection method that was relatively successful and relatively effective in the past was detecting whether there was metal inserted into a card reader, because metal generally isn't inserted into a card reader. Right. And now that it's a small, very thin piece of plastic as opposed to metal, you can't detect metal anymore, let alone the fact that some upscale cards are now made of metal, so that also kind of goes the other way too. So a lot of the detection methods that were effective 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, have become less effective because of the advances of technology, even though the end result is it's still doing a relatively old school read of 40-year-old technology, which is that mag stripe.
Right. And that gets us to card technology. Right. There's been a lot of movement over the last several years to transition financial institutions away from the mag stripe, fully embrace contactless or chip technology on their cards, and just do away with the stripe. We're still in that process, right? It involves point of sale systems getting rid of stripe too, and eventually there's going to be sort of this period where folks are going to be forced to get rid of your old card, or it's literally going to be useless. And this is all done under the vision of improved security on these cards. So EMV chips and secure contactless are safer than mag stripes because they're harder to fraud or to defraud, right?
Well, I think that's a big part. That's kind of like step one in understanding that difference too. Is that mag stripe that's on the back of your card holds data, but it holds data in the clear, right? So it doesn't take a whole lot of technology to pull data off of it because there's no encryption there. It's just it's the same as if data was typed onto a screen and you walked past a computer that had data typed on the screen. Like it's clear, it's right there. The EMV chip that has been on cards for a while now is very securely encrypted. And I mean, I've been doing this long enough to know you never say never. There's always a lot of smart people trying to commit fraud out there that will come up with something, but it's extremely hard to pull data off of an EMV chip. You can pull something off there, but it's encrypted in such a way that you can't really do anything with it. And secure contactless has followed that same encryption protocol. So those types of things on a card that have data on it that can be used for a purchase have that data held in a very secure format. But we still put this mag stripe on these cards too that has zero security around it. It's clear data that's very easy to pull off, which creates a vulnerability that people want to exploit because it's there and it's easy to pull, right? And fraud in general is always kind of like pushing on a balloon. Right? And you know, every time you put some strength on something, then people go to wherever kind of the least strong link in the chain is. And that mag stripe is still by far the weakest link in any kind of security chain when it comes to your financial data, your card member data, your card numbers, all that kind of stuff.
And this really highlights how much the mag stripe is still an essential part of the equation to Skim, right?
It is.
And so I'm curious if you can just clarify that for us. You know, does skimming happen in any other form, right? Are people skimming off of chips? Are they skimming off of contactless or other, you know, let's say camera-oriented ways that just try to, you know, scan for when you pull your card out, that sees the number, sees the PIN? Or is most skimming going to be limited to how the fraudster can get as precise and, you know, as stealthy as possible with capturing information off that mag stripe?
Yeah, I mean, again, you never say never, right? Because, you know, if all the fraudsters out there would instead kind of divert their attention to curing cancer, we'd probably have it cured by now because there's so much brain power put into it. But, you know, when the mag stripe is sitting there easy to read, you're going to go for the easiest. You're not going to say, well, I don't want to do that because the degree of difficulty is not hard enough. I'm going to try to do something more difficult when it's sitting right there. So the vast
Those are the
majority,
Olympic fraudsters.
That's
you know,
exactly right.
They're competing.
Yeah, they're doing the triple Lindy off the dashboard, right? So the vast majority of skimming fraud happens from reading the mag stripe, right? Because it's still there, and it's integral to the kind of enabling people to keep skimming, but it's in our current payments environment, it's not really integral to the process anymore. It's one of those vestigial things that people don't feel very uncomfortable giving up, because there are some circumstances where it's still used validly, and the whole EMV rollout which was multiple years and took a long time, but finally got to the point where pretty much every point of sale you go to now, you're using a chip read. There's still a very isolated number of things that don't have chip readers on them anymore, that they still scan that mag stripe, but the vast majority are reading chips now because of the liability rules, the shift in liability that was put in place to encourage that upgrade in hardware at points of sale, at ATMs, at gas pumps, at everything like that.
So and, I mean, here in the States too, I mean, most places even are touchless now too.
That's right, touchless as well.
That one even isn't the new up-and-coming technology. It's pretty standardized.
That is pretty
as well.
standard. And the mag stripe still sits there because when both of those scenarios were first launched, it was new technology, so sometimes it wouldn't work. And there was absolutely a need to have a fallback mechanism. Oh, you know, the chip on the card isn't working, it malfunctioned. Or even this brand new point of sale device, the chip reader is not working anymore. So there was this real need to have a backup plan on your card. And you know, now that technology, both the contactless and the chip technology, is very secure, very stable. Secure is right. It's very secure, but it's also very stable now. It's aged through a few generations, and it doesn't just randomly malfunction like it did before. All technology is going to malfunction every once in a while, but now it's to the point where it's very reliable technology. And that mag stripe now is really not kind of fulfilling a large need, but there's kind of still that, well, I don't want to give up that backup plan because it might be needed every once in a while. And so I think there's a little bit more of a reliance on keeping it than really is the real use case in the marketplace. But because it's still there, basically keeps a door ajar to fraudsters that can come in and steal that data relatively easily.
Right.
It's kind of like keeping your back door unlocked at home.
Yeah, and yeah, right. That's a great example. And two, there is sort of the tricky reality that for most ATM machines too, there's a security measure to insert your card and hold your card as sort of a way to make sure that you're not just keying in a code and that now lets you have access to someone's funds. There's a bit of that physical and digital security at a physical site. And so with that, even if the mag stripe on the card isn't being used to detect your account and to deposit or withdraw funds, there is still that opportunity where a fraudster might find a way to put some technology into the ATM that would still be able to capture info off the stripe, even if it's not being used in that transaction. So essentially, the mag stripe on these cards is still that biggest point of vulnerability. And so ending skimming in its current form, because, once necessity is the mother of invention, then who knows, we'll have a different conversation. But for now, getting that mag stripe off the card is probably the big next step to help reduce skimming. But I'm curious your thoughts on what other advancements we're seeing around card tech, ATM technology, the way the data is encrypted on or off the card, that's helping make skimming harder.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, so and that's a great question, and skimming, like any kind of security, preventing skimming like any kind of security mechanism you put in place, is always going to be most effective when you're layered, right? When you layer your security, right? So while I did say that those detection mechanisms at the card reader itself have become a little less effective, they're still not ineffective. So they still do provide some level of protection. So having the latest card readers that can detect when something was inserted that wasn't a card is always helpful, or having something that can detect when something is inserted that's foreign, like a foreign object, is always helpful. And that I mentioned kind of the latest card reader because we even take examples when we pull a skimmer off of one of our devices, and we'll work with a card reader manufacturer, a card reader specialist, to identify how the latest skimmers are getting past current detection mechanisms, so that then those detection mechanisms can be upgraded. Right. I mentioned before kind of the thinness, right? So continuing to work on the right space for an opening. I mentioned before a little bit about kind of being able to detect, having like detection mechanisms so you can detect when things are inserted. Yeah. Which is there not just for detecting skimmers, but also to be able to detect when a card is in, right? So you have multiple sensors in that need to be tripped in a certain order, and then it says, oh, it was tripped, that means the card was inserted. Right. And a lot of times skimmers will have won't be the entire shape of the card, they'll be only parts where it needs to be. So if not all of the sensors were tripped in the right order, then something was inserted that wasn't a card. Or again, foreign materials, the latest materials that are being used, being able to detect those kind of materials. So while it's less effective than it used to be, it's still one layer of a multi-layered defense that can be contributory to being able to prevent or minimize that fraud. Right. So that's one area. As cards continue to advance, and as card readers continue to advance, you'll have a little bit more security there. Fraud continues to advance, so now new types of skimmers come. So it's kind of that kind of escalating battle. Right. But keeping refreshed with the latest technology, similar to other areas where you keep refreshed with the latest technology, is a good way to have kind of your first layer of defense.
Totally. And then obviously there's the operational component and sort of the environmental steps as well that a financial institution can take to protect against skimming. Because if you set it up in a way to where it's difficult for the skimmer to even get in there to place their device, then you're in good shape, right? Or there's good monitoring to be able to detect, like, that person has been standing at that ATM tinkering with it for 60 seconds and hasn't put their card in, like, what's going on, right? So I'm curious what your thoughts there are on complementary operational strategies or environmental setup strategies for things like ATMs that can help contribute to dissuading or preventing skimming?
Right, and that's a very good point. That's a very good second layer to put on top of it. And you mentioned earlier at the beginning too, we as consumers, previous levels of technology, could pretty easily spot something if you really looked at it because it would kind of stick out. But as it's matured, it's harder to spot. However, like someone who's trained in it, a bank employee that will go look at it every day, they're gonna know better what to look for, especially if you use kind of examples of the latest hardware that has been captured from skimming attacks. You can relatively quickly train employees to be able to spot it a little easier than consumers like you and I that are just using an ATM once a month or a point of sale a couple times a day or whatever. And having a process where, like, in the morning, a quick run by of someone who's seen those examples and does a quick check is a good way to is a good preventative measure to have. Amping up that technology a little bit too when you start to get into kind of automated AI evaluation of video, because you were kind of hinting at that as you were kind of talking there as well. All banks and credit unions have video cameras from a security aspect. And some of the latest technology can put some artificial intelligence around reading those videos, a lot of times to prevent theft, a lot of times to prevent people who are going to attack the bank itself physically and try to rob it. But you can also have detection patterns for things like someone standing in front of an ATM and not doing a transaction, but instead monkeying with something, right? And that's also a very good layer of defense to have. It's a little bit more high tech than having a process that has somebody come and look. But again, multiple layers make prevention much more effective.
Right. Exactly. And a good strategy is making sure you've got 3 other backup strategies, right? So let's move now into condensing this landscape of potential defenses into a focused sort of step-by-step approach. So we've talked fraud detection, right? Sort of a supplemental.
Well, that's also a good layer of defense too, right? Because the other thing that's important to realize from an environment where you're trying to prevent skimming and prevent losses for your customers is that even if your front line of defense is so effective that no one ever can effectively put a skimmer on your ATM, your customers still use their card at a whole lot of other places that aren't under your control. Like I bank with a bank where my card has never been skimmed at an ATM, but my card got skimmed at a restaurant, at a point of sale. But the bank that I use had very good fraud detection mechanisms in place. So when the dude took my card number and made a purchase at a hookah lounge, literally, and that's not something that's in my, realm of,
spend. Yeah, you're not a hookah frequenter.
Right, exactly. So it tripped no offense to people who do.
For sure,
it's a perfectly viable hobby to have, but it's not something that I do, so it's not in my spending pattern. So when that transaction pops up, even though I was skimmed somewhere else, the bank still caught it before damage could be done, and it declined even the transaction because they attempted and the transaction got declined. So the bank wasn't even out money, let alone the merchant or me, because they stopped it before it happened and did the check with me to say, hey, is this really you? With kind of out of band communication, right? To make instead of having the merchant ask a question, they went to my phone and texted me. I'm like, well, no, I'm not at that hookah lounge right now, so that is not me. So yes, feel free to decline that transaction. So that is also, it's a very good investment for a bank or credit union to make anyways, but also a very significant layer of effectiveness from a preventative standpoint when it comes to skimming attacks. And you kind of mentioned this phrase at the beginning as well, taking value away from skim data. So even if someone does effectively skim a card number, if you've got good fraud detection rules on the back end as well, that stolen card number becomes less useful, less valuable. They can get less fraudulent activity out of it.
Right. And that gives banks, it gives merchants, it gives everyone in that pool that is hoping to deter skimming a confident, reactive tool set, right? And that's important to both have proactive and reactive ways to make sure skimming doesn't go all the way to fruition. Or if it does, that no one's really out that much money somehow, right? Insuring your assets, all that good stuff. So then there's obviously the proactive changes that need to happen as well. One of the big ones being eliminating the magnetic stripe at large. What does that timeline actually look like realistically for banking institutions? And I know this is different for the big players in the space versus your smaller regional bank. Maybe that timeline looks different. But where are we right now in that transition? And any advice or tips on how to speed that up to get rid of really the biggest entry point,
Sure.
the whole back door?
Right. Well, and that's also a great topic because it is becoming a relatively timely topic of conversation too in the industry. MasterCard has put out guidance that they plan on eliminating the mag stripe from all MasterCards in the next few years.
Right.
I believe that they put a deadline of 2027, but I think that changes depending on feedback they get. So at least they've put a stake in the ground saying we are moving to this.
Yes.
And once one of the big card networks does that, then all of the banks and credit unions that issue cards using that network would follow suit and meet those guidelines, right? So it's like it's the MasterCard and Visa and Discover and American Expresses of the world that kind of lead that charge a little bit, but it's a little bit of a kind of their MasterCard specifically is kind of putting that stake in the ground for a number of reasons. One, because they want to eliminate that kind of fraud, but two, they're hearing feedback from the banks and credit unions that use that network that they want to eliminate fraud as well, and it's a kind of a pushing from both ends gets kind of that change started, right? Visa hasn't been as definitive, but they've at least kind of put statements out that say they're evaluating when they're going to do it. Right. But MasterCard's been like the most vocal about it, saying we are going to eliminate it. But that's kind of the end point that we need to get to. Right. But that while that stripe is still on cards, you can also eliminate a little of the value of stolen data by closing the doors where that mag stripe can be used to make purchases, right? Because when a card is skimmed and they pull the data off the mag stripe, if they use it for in-person point of sale purchases, they're taking that data and then writing it to a blank card. Right. But they're writing it on the mag stripe. They are not writing it on the chip because they can't do the encryption, or they're not writing it on the contactless because they can't do the encryption. So that new fraudulent card is used only in a mag stripe type of transaction. So if you're going to, like if that person then would go to an ATM to try to withdraw money out of it, they'd put that fraudulent card in there. It would try to read the chip, it would say, fail on chip, and then it would fall back to a mag stripe read and allow you to read with the mag stripe.
Right.
And doing things like turning that off as well and not allowing a mag stripe transaction to occur. Right. Also starts to eliminate entry points where that information is useful, and it starts to eliminate places where a person can take that stolen card number and actually use it for fraudulent purposes. And the more of those doors you close, the less valuable that data is. And then ultimately, when we get to a point where we actually reach one of those deadlines and cards stop having the mag stripe on it, then it becomes even you can't even get the data anymore. But while the data is still there, closing more and more of those doors where it can be used is also an effective layer of prevention, right? Because even when you hit that date that MasterCard says, that no more mag stripes, well, that just means that starting then, new cards won't have it. But every card in your wallet is 3 or 4 or 5 years, expiration date. Right. So the true elimination is going to be 5 years after whatever date happens, because cards are still going to be out there until they have to be renewed 5 years later, right, or 4 years, or whatever the renewal cycle is. So they're different based on financial institution.
Sure. Right, yeah, there are natural cadences in that relationship between banking institution and customer where you can help guide the customer to phase out and maybe even encourage them, like, hey, if you want to, get a new card early,
also true. Yeah.
Maybe we'll give you, a $200 credit or something. Enjoy, right? Hey, points.
Right.
Gotta love the points. But there is, I think a good metaphor there, right? The mag stripe is the back door, And all of these other points of access are the keys. You've handed out 5 keys to your network to be able to get in your house if they need to, but those are points of liability, right? And so those could be the point of sale systems, those could be ATMs, those could be and any number of areas where that car is going to be put at risk to maybe feed data to a fraudster. And so both, as a good thing and a bad thing, the mag stripe is kind of everyone's responsibility, right? And everyone has a different relationship to skimming. But that's good because there's also motivation to try to prevent it from a lot of different stakeholders. So the merchant can invest in their point of sale system that eliminates the mag stripe and says, okay, sorry guys, we've leveled up. We no longer accept mag stripe here. And once you start to see that domino roll, right, your local ATM at your bank, maybe they'll still issue cards with mag stripe, but they've gone ahead and, replaced their technology so that if you have a card without mag stripe, it's just not going to get read. So little ways to start to change the whole ecosystem will eventually domino into a truly qualitative change, small quantitative changes into a larger sort of fundamental shift. So hopefully we start to see that happen soon.
Yeah. But in the meantime, there's still layers of prevention and layers of effective things that you can put on top of each other. And again, the more layers that you put on there, the more secure your environment's going to be.
Right. So to summarize then, and to give an action plan for our audience, if I guess let's focus on financial institutions, right? If they're a financial institution out there and it's their turn to make some decisions that are going to hopefully try to deter skimming or make them, to shore up their defenses at the very least, what kind of recommendations would you offer? Where should they start?
Yeah, so there's a couple of short-term and a couple of long-term vectors there, right? So the short-term pieces are making sure that your card reader technology is the latest. Making sure that it's updated with the latest kind of preventative measures.
Right.
And then on top of that, ensuring that you have a good process in place to allow for review, allow for kind of just visual inspection on a regular basis from people who know what to look for on a regular basis. So I think those kind of 2 relatively short-term layers are good layers to kind of provide some level of protection. Leveling up from a site security standpoint and looking into the ability to use the video that you're already taking to secure your environment, also in a way to potentially be able to detect when people are there doing things that aren't transaction related, is a good longer term project to look into, because that's not something you just turn on right away, but it's something that you can spin up a project for and put something out there that adds another layer of security. Right. Working through your fraud detection environment specifically to ensure that transactions that are atypical for your customers or your members don't just get greenlit all the time is another very important exercise that has benefits anyways and should be a regular part of your process, but especially when it comes to skimming prevention, having a very good kind of layer of fraud transaction detection out of bounds types of transactions for your customers and members provides a very effective layer of security on that as well.
Sure.
And then, that kind of that one of the top layer of the parfait, I guess, would be, thinking about also all those doors where you are approving transactions that were indicated as a mag stripe transaction, because part of the data on the card also says whether it's got a chip or not. That was part of the initial implementation of those EMV chips was, it has to, the system will have to know whether the chip is on the card. Well, that's pretty universal now. Almost all cards have those chips, but it still definitively says, hey, there should be a chip on this card.
Right.
And that stolen data will still say that even if the chip's not present because it was a fraudulently created card.
Right.
So refusing to approve a transaction that was done by the swipe instead of the chip,
right,
in as many areas as possible is also a great way to cut off the use of that card. and going kind of through all of those layers and ensuring that kind of each one of those layers is as kind of as buttoned up as possible, really kind of then gives you an environment where you are as protected as possible from that data theft, that fraud, that backdoor.
And I think with that in mind, financial institutions can feel confident knowing that it doesn't take a massive overhaul to completely, get on top of the current iteration of skimming, because in a lot of ways it's really just shoring up defenses that they've already been thinking about and have already been, points of access for bad actors in the past. It's just about finding ways maybe to link those defenses in ways that turn defense number 1 through defense number 5, instead of backup layers, actually layers that kind of speak to each other and can be collaborative points of defense, rather than, well, okay, they got past the first wall, now let's put up the second one. It's instead, well, what if it's a maze instead?
Exactly.
Right?
That's a good analogy.
Yeah. So I think with that, we've given our audience our crash course here on skimming today, what it looks like, how bad actors are seeking to take advantage of legacy, points of failure, I guess, in the larger security ecosystem of finance, and how banking institutions and the whole ecosystem of folks that are entrusted with securing quality transactions, how they can all step up and play a role in reducing skimming for everyone, really for you and me, for the customer, right? Because that's really the main goal here. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's episode. So thank you so much, Bill, for your analysis per usual, for giving our audience this crash course. And I'm looking forward to tapping into your insights here for the rest of the year, because I know we've got some other podcasts coming up. So
it's always great to be here.
Thanks for having me. Always, man. And last but not least, I know you put out a companion article on this topic as well on y'all's website, and you as a media ecosystem, you'll have a lot of useful resources to help financial institutions and this whole ecosystem get up to speed on current threats, how to maneuver them, etc. Where can we point them for that kind of thought leadership?
So yeah, on our website, hyosunginnovue.com. We have a whole section of insights and subject matter expertise on a number of different topics, and that's where this article is as well, the companion article to our conversation today, as well as things on recycling technology and the latest in that, customer experience type technology and that kind of stuff. A lot of different content out there, whether it's videos or whether it's kind of 5 to 7 minute read blog posts, things like that. Not too much time to take up, but kind of like snippets of different topics. So a lot of different content out there, depending on what you're looking for from a subject matter perspective.
Perfect. Well, you heard it here, folks. Head to hyosunginnovue.com for all of that great educational media, so that you can get up to speed on these trends and strategies and where Hyosung fits into that equation of elevating your human experiences, whether that's a retail one, a banking one, you name it. Hyosung's here to help make that a more secure and efficient and customer-forward one as well. So, Bill, thank you so much for your analysis today. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to the next one.
Thanks. Looking forward to it too.
Yeah. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's episode. Again, we've been chatting with Bill Buddy, Vice President of Banking Strategy and Solutions for Hyosung. And if you like what you heard and saw today and you want to tap into previous episodes of our podcast, again, you want to access some of our media resources and our educational resources, or just learn more about Hyosung, you can head to our website, hyosunginnovue.com. Again, that's hyosunginnovue.com. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And until next time, I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. We'll catch you on the next episode of Human Experience Elevated.